Gossip is one of the more common sins of our age. In the papers, some people like to read the gossip column, right? On the magazine rack, when you're checking out at the grocery store, we look at the headlines on the gossip magazines. At the water cooler at work, some people go there to catch up on the latest gossip. And in churches, sometimes we think strong friendships means that we share gossip with one another, and our gossip partners can often turn into sinful cliques. And even among some preachers and church leaders, gossip about other preachers and churches and magazines can become an addiction. And frankly, it's probably one of the reasons that I've always in my local work tried to keep my head down and work and never been too tight with many preachers personally, because I grew up hearing lots of preacher gossip and my family being the subject of preacher gossip, and it turns my stomach. Gossip is not welcomed in the pages of Scripture. In fact, one could argue the very first sin was the result of gossip. In Genesis 3, the serpent gossiped about God. He said something about God that was unfavorable, suggesting that God was keeping Eve from something that would really enhance her life. And so making an unfavorable statement about God's restrictions and saying something that was just flat out untrue about God's rules. Eve believed what she heard and passed along that information to her husband Adam, and they both ate of the forbidden fruit. Gossip ensnares us in a destructive sin too. And so today, we're going to think about God's teaching on it so that we can correct it and so that we can shine our lights in the world. And certainly one way we can do that is by guarding our tongues. James 3 says it's really hard to tame your tongue. And I think we can talk about sins of the tongue and temptations of the tongue often, because it's one of our biggest temptations from time to time. So we think about that word gossip. There are several different ways that we can sin with our tongues. And so today we're going to deal with gossip and what I would call the close cousins of gossip. We'll call it the gossip family. The Bible uses the word gossip in passages like 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 13. It uses the word gossip in Romans 1:29. If you're looking at a New American Standard, it uses that word. But the gossip has close cousins too. Sometimes the Bible uses the word tale bearer or idle talker. And so in Titus chapter 1 and verse 10, it says, there are many insubordinate, both idle talkers and deceivers. And what I think is interesting is what he says right after that. He says, especially those of the circumcision. Who's the circumcision? Well, it's Jews. It's religious people. Paul, as he's writing to Timothy, says there's a lot of religious people that are idle talkers, and you need to watch out for them. And so idle talk is part of that gossip family. There are some who are tale bearers. The word that we probably used when we were kids is tattletales. They just like to tell stories about other people. In Proverbs chapter 18 and verse 8, it says the words of a tale bearer are like tasty trifles. Some people like to hear tales of other people, whether true or not. And that's why we're sometimes attracted to the gossip magazine headlines and the clickbait headlines that probably come up on your computer just like they do on mine when I log in. Some people like those tales, and so they read about them and they thrive on them. In the Bible, you also see the word prater or false accuser, some versions would say, and that's what Diotrephes was in 3 John verse 10. And John was not happy with Diotrephes. He says, I will call to mind his deeds, which he does. He prates against us with malicious words. And so Diotrephes was causing division in the church, actually speaking against the apostles themselves. And so he's a prater. He's falsely accusing them of things. He wanted the preeminence and the prominence. And then in scriptures, we also have slanderer. That could be a mister too. But Romans chapter 1 and verse 30 talks about slander. You know, in the Old Testament, there was a law against this sort of thing, about this type of talk. In Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 16, it says, "You shall not go about as a talebearer among your people." God did not want people going around telling stories about other people and talking bad about other people and telling tales. He says, "Nor shall you take a stand against the life of your neighbor. I am the Lord." God didn't like it in the Old Testament, and as we see with many of these New Testament references, it's still a sin in the New Covenant. There was an article in Christian Woman magazine many years ago written by a lady named Debbie Scales. And as she thought about Leviticus 19 and verse 16, she wrote this. She said, "This verse brings to mind the picture of a person making her way through the ranks of the already murmuring and unhappy Israelite travelers. And as she goes up and down among the people, she whispers the latest news of the camp. She says things like, 'Don't quote me on this, but I've heard that Moses may be on his way out. There are other men, you know, who could lead just as well as Moses anyway, probably better. And by the way, have you noticed how the Zuriel family is always the first group out to gather manna every morning? I probably shouldn't even mention it, but there's no need to be greedy if you ask me. Oh, there go those rambunctious Ashbel boys again. I do wish their parents would control them a little better. I don't like to talk about people, but the way they let those boys behave is just a shame.'" Have you ever felt that kind of talk? That's a talebearer. That's what talebearers do. Let's think about some of these definitions. I think talebearer is pretty obvious. Idle talker, you're just talking about things that aren't important and that are perhaps destructive. But let's think about a couple words. The word gossip. If we're going to understand what gossip is, we've got to define it. So gossip, as it's used in 1 Timothy 5:13, it means to boil, to bubble, as with heat. It's a tattler, an idle or trifling talker. Somebody who just talks about trifling things. One who boils over with impertinent talk. Webster's defines it as idle talk or rumors, and especially about the personal or private affairs of other people. So that's gossip. Now let's think about the word slander that's used in Romans 1 and verse 30. Strong's defines that as it means to be talkative against. Okay, when you're slandering someone, you're talking about somebody. And many times it's also defined as a backbiter. You're not saying it to their face, you're saying it about them behind their back. And so you're taking little bites out of their back from behind them. Webster's would define a slander as a false tale or report that is maliciously uttered and tends to injure the reputation of another by lessening him in the esteem of his fellow citizens, by exposing him to impeachment and punishment, or by impairing his means of lying. It is defamation. We're speaking against their character. And the Hebrew word for slander literally means bad report. It's a bad report. So the difference between these two words is really just one of degrees. Suppose, it's not something that you should suppose very often, but suppose that you wanted to kill someone. Okay? There's more than one way to do it. You could take a shotgun and you could walk right behind them and announce that you're going to shoot them and then blow them away. That's really what slander does. Comes up behind somebody and just blows away their character. Not them personally, but their character. Or, if you wanted to murder someone, you can take a rifle, you can put a scope on it, you can attach a silencer to it, and you could hide yourself a safe distance away where you're probably not going to be seen, and you could shoot them from long distance. And they're never going to know what hit them or who started it. That's gossip. Both of these terms deal with negative talk about others. Gossip is negative implications. Maybe what we call necessary inferences, right? we're kind of saying some things and we're letting people kind of put together the pieces so that they can infer something negative about someone. But slander is direct accusations. One, gossip is sneaky, it's subtle, it's a subtle way to injure character. The other is a more bold, leaving no doubt method of blowing away their character. But they both do the same and accomplish the same thing, just in different methods. Now I want to think about gossip, some misconceptions that we have about gossip. Because sometimes I think we label things as gossip that really aren't. Some believe that talking about anyone, anytime, for any reason, constitutes gossip. My name even comes up in a conversation, you must be gossiping about me. But I would suggest to you that scripturally gossip is not so broad. For example, Jesus praised other people outside of their presence, didn't he? John the Baptist's name comes up in Matthew chapter 11. John the Baptist isn't there because he's in jail. And John the Baptist offers some glowing compliment, or Jesus offers some glowing compliments about John the Baptist in this passage. And so bringing up someone else's name, especially when it's in positive praise of that person, is not gossip just because this name came up. Jesus did it, and Jesus was sinless. But Jesus also spoke critically of those who refused to obey his message, and he did so openly in Matthew chapter 23, verses 1 through 33. And what the Pharisees were practicing openly, he exposed those things openly to his audience, even saying, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And so, not bringing up someone's name or even bringing up a group's name is not always necessarily gossip. Jesus did that. The Apostle John did that as well. In 3 John 12, he praises Demetrius. And then in 3 John 9 through 11, he calls Diotrephes a prater and a false accuser, and he warns people about him. And so there are situations, I think as we just look at this briefly, there are situations where it is important for members of the church to consult with each other, for example. For example, you look at Matthew chapter 18 in discipline situations that come before the church. If someone has offended you, Matthew 18 says you should go talk to that person first. That's important. But if you don't settle it with that person, you take one or two spiritually minded people with you, which requires what? It requires you go talk to one or two spiritually minded people and bring them with you so that you can involve them in that conversation. And so that you can be a remedy to that problem. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 11, the reason why Paul knows what he knows about Corinth is because Chloe's household had told him things that were going on in Corinth. They had consulted with Paul. They didn't, by the way, do it anonymously. They didn't send him an anonymous letter. Here's what's going on in Corinth, and I'm not going to tell you who's writing this letter. No, Paul cites, here's who told me. It has been told me by those of Chloe's household that there are problems in this church, and chapter after chapter he addresses those problems. And so there are times where we might have to consult with church leaders about public unrepented sin, 1 Corinthians 6, that goes on. You've got someone who's a fornicator in the church, and Paul publicly addresses it in a letter. So sometimes those situations have to happen. There's also times we have to consult with one another in the case of church officers. In Acts 6, the first deacons are appointed. And so he tells the whole congregation, you guys have to have a discussion with one another about who you would select for these particular roles. And you're going to have to come to a conclusion about who will be selected. And so we see that in that's going to be a part sometimes of our conversations as a church. But these exceptions in dealing with others are more rare than the problem of gossip. And I think it'd be a good rule of thumb that we be very, very careful not to excuse what really is gossip as I'm just trying to help. And so we're going to get into that a little bit more. I like this poem, and I want to read it to you as you think about it. And it just asks us to consider treating people the way that you would want to be treated and thinking of people in the best possible light. But this poem goes like this. Wouldn't this old world be better if folks we meet would say, I know something good about you, and then treat you that way? Wouldn't it be fine and dandy if each hand clasp, warm and true, carried with it this assurance: I know something good about you? And wouldn't life be lots more happy if the good that's in us all were the only thing about us that folks bothered to recall? Wouldn't life be lots more happy if we praised the good we see? For there's a lot of goodness in the worst of you and me. And wouldn't it be nice to practice that fine art of thinking too? You know something good about me, and I know something good about you. I like that poem because I think it describes a mentality that we need to consider and we need to have with one another that will help us to try to avoid gossiping and sharing the worst. Well, what do we do when we share the worst? What are some of the strategies that we see when it comes to gossip? How does it work? How does gossip work? How do we identify it? Well, one of the things that we see with gossip is that it is revealing personal information. The Bible talks about confiding in others and even confessing our trespasses to others so they might pray for us. And so sometimes in a church, if someone confides in you and if someone asks to pray with you and for you, which we should be comfortable enough to do with one another, as James 5:16 says, sometimes you're going to know something about someone or their relationships or situations or temptations or weaknesses. And if someone's confiding in you, it's because they're asking for your help and your strength. But if we reveal this information to other people and it damages their character, then we gossip. So when someone confides in you, they do it for help. They're not doing it so they can become a source of your dinner entertainment or coffee talk. And so when you reveal personal information, you may be guilty of gossip, and you be careful about that. Gossip also sees the bad in others and ignores the good. And the poem that we just said kind of addresses that. Now, there are times that we need to expose the bad and evil in others. We've already mentioned that with Jesus and the Pharisees in John 23 and John and Diotrephes in 3 John. But the problem is, usually we're talking about the bad to the wrong person. That's where the problem lies. If you're talking about the bad that exists in someone or the evil that exists in someone, you're not talking about it to them to help them. You're talking about them to other people, then you're not really dealing with the problem. You're not helping the problem. And so it's not necessarily wrong to see bad in others and to rebuke and admonish and warn, but make sure you're doing it to the right person and not the wrong ones. Sometimes the gossip exaggerates statements, exaggerates scenarios, exaggerates situations. Sometimes that's how we do it. In my closet, I have a Jerry Garcia tie that somebody bought for me years ago. Jerry Garcia is one of the band members from the Grateful Dead. I do not believe that I would endorse much of the lyrics, the music, or the philosophy of this band. Okay? But let's assume I wear this Jerry Garcia design tie, and somebody finds out I'm wearing a Jerry Garcia tie. And so you tell everybody, the preacher was wearing a Jerry Garcia tie today. He must like Jerry Garcia. He must like the Grateful Dead. He must like that ungodly music. Our preacher is going liberal. Have you maybe exaggerated the situation just a little bit? Tara was over last night, and Tara wanted to watch Edward Scissorhands. Okay, I haven't seen Edward Scissorhands for whenever it came out, like 25 years ago. And so we're watching Edward Scissorhands, but there's this scene that's very relevant to this, where at the beginning, it's when the Avon lady goes and picks up Edward Scissorhands from his house and brings her to her house, and all of the women in the neighborhood get on the phone. Did you see who was in the car with her? Man, I wonder what, she must be having an affair or something. She's got a young boy in her car with her. And so they're on the phone and they're meeting on the corners and they're talking to them, and they're clearly misrepresenting, exaggerating, mislabeling the situation. Sometimes we do that. And that's gossip. It's gossip, and it's destructive. Gossip also repeats all knowledge without discretion. There's things that my wife knows about me and I know about her that nobody else has business knowing. It's between us. It's private. Telling others would be hurtful to me or hurtful to her. And so there's things that we keep to ourselves in our family. But some people are missing that filter in their brain. And if we think that we can just tell everything we know about everyone we know, then you need to think again, because you may be guilty of gossip. You need to show discretion, be discreet. That's one of the things that older women have to be teaching younger women in Titus chapter 2 is how to be discreet. And part of that is being very careful with what we talk about. Sometimes we gossip, though, because we're exacting vengeance. And sometimes we use it as a means to get back at someone. It's a handy tool. You just start a little rumor, pass on some juicy information, maybe even embellish it a little bit, and you can do a good job of getting even with someone who has hurt you or getting ahead. And one of the ways that we do that is we say things like, don't tell anybody I told you this, but. Or we say things like, if I tell you about this person, you promise not to tell anyone. Or don't quote me on this. You should really not say anything that someone can't quote you on. Just a good rule of thumb in life. Don't quote me on this, but I'm going to go ahead and say something. Or people say, I don't like to talk about people, but and then they talk about people. That's gossip. Now, we have excuses for why we do that. We have justifications for our habit. As with every sin, we've got excuses and justifications. And somebody might say, well, I just said that because I just needed to vent. I just needed to blow off some steam. If your venting means that you are negatively portraying others without talking to them, you are sinning. Proverbs 29 and verse 11, if you have a venting problem where you're a common venter, you need to jot down Proverbs 29 and verse 11, circle it, highlight it, and remind yourself of it when you're tempted to do it. It says, a fool vents all his feelings. It's foolish. But a wise man holds them back. There's some things you just sometimes need to keep to yourself. Or if you catch yourself saying things like, well, I don't mean to gossip, but there's no buts about it. You mean to do it. And if you don't mean to do it, then don't do it. One of the fruits of the Spirit, self-control. And if the Spirit's working in us through the Word, then we have to exhibit self-control with what we say and who we talk to with our tongues. Sometimes we'll say this, well, maybe I'm being too critical, but isn't everyone, right? The problem isn't being critical. The problem is when you are critical of other people to other people instead of to them. Matthew 18:15 says, if someone has done something that is sinful or is a trespass, then you should go talk to them. So the problem is not about being critical. The problem is when we're critical to the wrong people, and it doesn't really help. Or we say things like this, well, it's not gossip if it's a true story. Can I just say not all true stories need to be told? Somebody has committed an indiscretion in their marriage, doesn't matter really when, years ago, months ago, yesterday, but they apologized, they confessed it to one another, they fixed it, then you don't need to bring it up and retell the story ever again. It's been fixed. It's in the past. And so it might be true what you're telling, but it doesn't mean it needs to be told. Miriam and Aaron were talking about something true when they were talking about Moses being married to an Egyptian woman, but God was still upset because they had no business talking about it and disparaging him because of who he married. It was true, but they shouldn't have been talking about it, and they were rebuked. And so it might be true, and that doesn't make it not gossip because it is true. There's some things that are true that we need to not talk about. Well, why do we do that? What's the fuel behind gossip? What motivates gossip? Because a little dose of gossip can fuel a big fire. That's really what James 3 says, is with your tongues, you can really start a big fire. One little tiny tongue in your mouth can really start a whole forest fire. So why do we do it? Well, sometimes we do it because we don't have the proper value of people that we need to have. One who gossip about someone's life, especially their sin, then you see that person as entertainment and not as a lost soul. And you have the wrong perspective about people. We should have more value for our neighbors and more value for lost souls. Matthew 22:39 talks about the first and second great commandment. The first commandment is love God, right? Second commandment is love people. Love your neighbor. And so if you're fulfilling that first and second commandment, then don't tell me that you love people while you're devaluing them by what you're saying about them. I wouldn't like that if something like that was done to me, and other people don't like it when it's done to them. And so part of love is loving your neighbor as yourself, treating them the way that you would wish to be treated. And so sometimes we don't value people. Diotrephes prayed against the apostles because he wanted to be the church chieftain. He valued himself more than others. And it showed his selfishness by doing so. Sometimes we walk on other people's backs up the ladder of popularity and success. So we talk about people because we think we're going to climb up their backs and people will see us as more important. Proverbs 16:28 says, a perverse man sows strife, and a whisperer separates the best of friends. One old saying says this, blowing out somebody else's candle doesn't make yours shine brighter. And I like that phrase. Blowing out somebody else's candle doesn't make yours shine brighter. And so you shouldn't have to do that for people to notice that you're a decent person. So sometimes we don't value people. Second reason, pride likes insider information. Have you ever known somebody who always needed to be the first person to know something and they wanted to be the first person to tell you something? That's prideful. Pride is what makes us do that. 1 John chapter 2 calls pride a sin. But it appeals to our pride. If we know something and we get to reveal that something, it makes us feel powerful in some small way. And we need to be guarded against that type of pride. Sometimes we gossip because we just want to hear things. We want to hear tales. Proverbs 18:8 says, the words of a talebearer are like tasty trifles. We just kind of enjoy a good story. And so a willing mouth is often encouraged by a ready ear. And if you hear tales about other people and you don't rebuke the tales that you're hearing about other people, then you're encouraging the gossip instead of shutting it down. Sometimes we gossip because we're too idle. The women of 1 Timothy 5 and verse 13, they were too idle, and Paul wanted them to be more busy, so they had a lot less downtime to gossip. So sometimes we just need to keep ourselves busier doing good deeds and good things, keeping ourselves busier in the kingdom so we kill off that extra time where the devil uses our idle hands and idle mouths as his workshop. So we keep ourselves busier to fend off the temptation. And maybe we gossip because we're just nosy. Just nosy. Some parts of people's personal lives and issues, though, are just not any of our business. 1 Peter 4:11 rebukes those who are a busybody in other people's matters. So we need to honestly assess whether we're truly concerned with others or just addicted to being nosy and having fresh information to talk about. And that's the fuel. That's the fuel. Well, how do we extinguish it? Because this isn't any good if we just kind of call out gossip and call out what it is, and we don't think of ways that we can help put out the fire. And so I want to suggest to you a few things that when this situation arises, and it will, whether it be here or at school, this school year, we've been dealing with all kinds of issues from kids with other kids just running their mouths too much. So you're going to deal with it at school. You're going to deal with it at work. You're going to deal with it sometimes in the church and in families even. So how do we put it out? Well, one thing, keep confidences. Someone does confide in you and does talk to you and trusts in you. If they find out that you spread that to other people, you will ruin that relationship and ruin that trust. Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 13 says, a talebearer reveals secrets, but he who is of a faithful spirit conceals a matter. So let people talk to you about their weaknesses and about their temptations and about the things that they need you to pray for, and keep it confidential with them as much as is possible. So they trust you, and so you can build that relationship, and so that you can continue to be of help and build that bond. Another thing is just speak positively. And accentuate the positive. Philippians 4 and verse 8 gives us a way to think as Christians that this has always been one of my favorite passages. But it says, finally, brethren, whatever things are true. Now, he's going to eventually say, meditate on these things. Think about these things. Think about what? Think about things that are true. And if you don't know it's true, don't you dare be passing it on or give it another consideration. Whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, and whatever things are pure, and whatever things are lovely, and of good report. Talk good about somebody. Think about something you can praise. If there's any virtue, anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. Just think about the good. And don't spend all your time trying to think about the worst possible things you can share and talk about. There's a Chinese proverb. It says, speak only well of people, and you need never whisper. And I like that idea. Speak only well of people, and you never need to whisper. And by the way, it can be a very uncomfortable thing when you're sitting in a classroom or you're at a dinner table or even in church and somebody starts whispering or they start turning away from you so they can have this conversation. It's an uncomfortable thing. People often assume you're having to whisper because you're talking about them. It's an immaturity. Speak positively about people. You don't ever have to do that. You can speak openly. You don't have to be ashamed about what you're saying. Speak accurately and with purity. Ephesians 4:15 says, speak the truth. And if you don't know something is true, again, you don't always have to spread it, even if it is true. But if you don't know it's true, you definitely don't need to be speaking it. Speak the truth and do it in love. Do it with pure motives. And this encompasses that expectation. Words need to be true, motivated by love. The other thing I would say is avoid gossips. 1 Corinthians 15:33 says, evil companions corrupt good morals. And we tell our kids, right? That means don't hang out with people who are drinking and doing drugs at school and fornicating. It also means don't hang out with people who are going to be a temptation in what they're talking about and what they're saying. If your friends are gossips, then you need to shut it down or find new friends. And if it's family, shut it down or distance yourself. If it's church members, address it or keep your distance. Ann Landers once said this. She said, people of high intelligence talk about ideas. People of average intelligence talk about things. People of low intelligence talk about other people. Why make companions with those types of people? Sometimes you just need to have the courage to dismiss yourself from a conversation. You're sitting at dinner and you're going to start talking, hey guys, I think it's time for me to go. I don't want to be part of this. My mom tells a story about when she was, I should be careful about preaching a gossip sermon and then saying my mom tells a story about, but when she was a young preacher's wife and they had just moved to Indianapolis and there were some women who got together and they kind of had a club night once or twice a week or things like that. And she said she went a time or two to that. She's a preacher's wife. She's expected to go to those sorts of things. And she went and she said, well, as I was sitting there, I noticed that everybody who wasn't there was getting talked about at those club nights and at those things. And I just wasn't comfortable with that, so I quit going. And it wasn't but a few months later that I found out I was getting talked about. And then I found out that this group that was together and was tight-knit, that they were pushing an agenda to try to get the preacher fired and didn't think that his wife was being social enough with that group. Could be church groups. And you got to shut it down when it's going on. I've always thought of it this way, and this helps me. And I'm not saying that I'm been perfect or have been perfect. Certainly, I'm like anybody. Sometimes I struggle with my tongue, and there are times where I've thought to myself, I really shouldn't have said that, and I regret it. And there's times I've had to just apologize. Shouldn't have said that. I talked about something with you, and I should not have talked about that. So I'm sorry. But something that helps me is realizing that God is listening. And God records everything. And sometimes as I think about the judgment, I don't know what it's going to be like. There's a lot of things we don't know. But in my mind, I know God has this capability. I think about me getting up there to the judgment seat, and God has a DVR. And he's got this big flat screen behind him. And I walk up there, and he says, your worst nightmares, you didn't get in. Why? Well, I'm going to play back some things that I saw you say. And we're just going to sit here, and we're going to play back those conversations of things that you said. And I was listening, and you were hurting other people, and you were injuring God's people. And I told you that every idle word that men may speak, they will give an account of it in the day of judgment in Matthew 12:36. And I know you quoted that. In fact, I can play that back in sermons. And I know you quoted it. So I know you know it. So why did you involve yourself in these conversations? And for me, that helps me. Maybe it helps you. Do you ever think, there's some things that, even if nobody else from church finds out about it, there's some things I know God's listening, I know God's watching, and I don't want him to hit playback when I'm there. Thankfully, forgiveness means that God's erased the playback and he's erased the DVR. But it also means that I've promised to repent and change my life. And so I don't need to give him any more material. Be ready also to respond constructively. Jesus did. When people wanted to throw the adulterous woman at his feet, he simply told them, "He who is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone." And he shut it down. And so what are some things that we can do when we hear this and when it comes up? Can I just make a few suggestions? And these are suggestions that have been made to me over the years. I know one preacher, whenever somebody would come to him, and sometimes people come to preachers and come to elders and things like that, he said, "Okay, hold on. You're going to bring up somebody's name. Let me get out my notepad. Is it okay if I write this down and quote you on this?" And sometimes people are a lot more hesitant to say things if they don't want to be quoted on it. Sometimes what we do is we just change the tone of the conversation. And instead of talking negatively, we say, "You know what I like about this person? Let me tell you something good this person did to me." Change the tone. Move the conversation. Have the gift of moving the conversation in a positive direction rather than a negative direction. If somebody brings something up, and maybe it is sinful or wrong, then maybe the question we need to ask is, well, now that we know this, how can we help them? So what can you and I do so that we can help this? Because I'm not just going to sit here and have this conversation and not be involved in helping the situation. How can we help? Another question you might ask, especially when it's a private matter, is, hey, before you talk to me about this, have you talked to them about this? Because Matthew 18 says you should talk to them first. You go see if you can settle it with them first. Or Or you can just simply say, you know what, I feel very uncomfortable with this conversation. And sometimes it's good for people to know that maybe they've crossed a line. And then finally, have the humility to apologize. That's one of the things we're supposed to do as Christians. We confess our faults. What's our faults? Sometimes our faults is that we said something about someone or in a way that we should not have said, or left an impression that we should not have left, and we need to be willing to admit that's a fault and apologize. Gossip, it can split churches, it can ruin reputations, it can injure relationships. And so just say sorry when you get called out with it, or when your conscience is pricked, and be more careful. The THINK acronym is helpful, perhaps. Before you repeat a story, ask yourself the THINK acronym. Is it true? There's your T word. Is it true? Is it harmless? There's your H word. Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? Did I talk about this? And is it kind? And if it isn't, then don't repeat it. Don't repeat it. Well, you might think, and I like to take every lesson, and at the end of it, as we offer the invitation, I like to take a moment to apply it to Jesus. But gossip is pretty serious. It's so serious that it's exactly one of the things that led to Jesus being put on the cross. Matthew 26, take a look at what the enemies of Jesus were doing. You read in verse 59, Matthew 26, it says, the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death. They wanted to hear tales about Jesus that were untrue because they hated him. They didn't find any. Verse 60 says, but it says, many false witnesses did come forward, but they found none. But at last 2 false witnesses came forward and said, well, this fellow said, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. And the high priest arose and said, do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? And Jesus kept silent. And that's one of the things that we admire about Jesus, is that in the face of his enemies, he was like a lamb. He was like the sheep led to the slaughter who was silent while everyone else was making false accusations. And as you think about that, and as you think about Jesus, just ask yourself, in your life, you can be like Jesus. And you can say nothing that's going to incriminate you. And just be silent if that's what it takes. And do right in the face of your enemies. Or you can be like his enemies. You can gossip and you can collude and you can slander to destroy other people. You think hard about which camp you want to be in. Because I want to be in Camp Jesus. And Jesus, in 1 Peter 2, we read that he was someone who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth. And when he was reviled, he didn't revile in return. He didn't threaten. He didn't slander. He spoke truth when he spoke. And that's the camp that I want to be in. That's the camp that if we're Christians, we all need to be in.